America didn't begin with the Constitution. It began with the people who already knew how to live free. Before there were elections, courts, written rights, there was something deeper holding society together. A shared understanding of truth, duty, restraint, and responsibility. The founders did not invent that understanding. They inherited it. And they built the American Republic on the assumption that it would continue. That inheritance has a name, the Western Christian Paideia. Now, I recently heard of this word Paideia in the WCP when I read Pete Hegseth's book, The Battle for the American Mind. And when I read that, I'd noticed a couple things were happening. We're almost at 100 episodes with this show. I noticed a couple things. I originally started this show to help educate Americans, help educate Christians, Christian Americans, help educate the left, obviously. And what I learned is that Americans don't really care about being educated. They just don't, right? I mean, as I tried to engage in stuff online and social media like that, what I found is that more people are interested in their own little bubble world, right? Their own little bubble that they hold, individualism. Let's just say it that way. And the same is true with Christians. I'm a Christian, but I just found that these individuals, and it's a good portion of the right, aren't interested in learning truth. They're not. They're only interested in spouting their own belief, right? What they hold true. And some of it is good. Some of it is true, but some of it is just absolute ridiculous stupidity. One of the things I noticed is that I'd been shadow banned on YouTube, so no one was really seeing anything. And then, if you're not a huge political individual who is, politically famous or whatever on Rumble, you're not getting seen, right? If you're not blowing with the latest trend of Cardi B being the next frickin' voice of the Republican Party, no one's watching you. And that's okay. I did this to try and educate. That was the point, right? I wanted to educate. And when I heard this, when I read this part of the Western Christian Paideia in Pete Hegseth's book, I wondered why I'd never heard of it. Right? I know that hundreds of thousands of people probably read these books by Pete Hegseth. But why weren't we talking about this concept of a Western Christian Paideia, especially when it comes to education? So that's what we're going to talk about today. I know it was a little bit of a rant. It might sound like I'm whining. I don't give a rip what you think, to be honest. So our republic will continue to exist for our republic, for our country. I'm no longer doing it for me. I am doing it for me. That's a lie. I'm doing it for me. All right, I'm now doing it for me, and I'm doing it for our republic. And I'm hoping that more people see it so that more people can understand what we were founded on and how incredible our nation is as it comes to its 250th birthday. Welcome to our republic.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political band,
sailors and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force.
Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the founding fathers. Not one small step for man.
Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be.
We pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
This one's going to be a little bit longer. A lot of it is coming from the book Battle for the American Mind, written by Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, a man that I support unequivocally. As a veteran, I support him fully. This comes from my own research on the topic as well. So this one's going to be a little bit long. All right. So let's get into it. Definition. Paideia is not schooling. It's not job training, and it's not it's not information. It's formation. It's the shaping of a whole person. What a person, about what a person believes is right or wrong, how they discipline themselves, what they honor, what they restrain, what they believe they are accountable for what they're accountable to when no one is watching, what they even consider to be the good life, right? Like what we used to consider the American dream. The Western Christian Paideia is a civilizational process by which generations were formed to govern themselves before attempting to govern others. It is Western because it emerges from the confusion of Greek reason and Roman law. It is Christian because Christianity supplied the moral authority, restraint, and view of human nature that made liberty possible. And it is a paideia because it forms character, not just minds. This is a system that taught men to master appetite, respect law, submit power to truth, and treat freedom as a responsibility, not a license. The American founders assumed this formation. They did not argue for it. They did not try to legislate it. They built a republic that required it. And that assumption is the single most misunderstood fact about American history. Without the WCP, or the Western Christian Paideia, the Constitution makes zero sense. The limits make no sense. The trust in the people make no sense. Its refusal to micromanage morality makes no sense. The Constitution does not create virtue because it assumes virtue already exists. It restrains power because it assumes the conscious restrains behavior. It limits government because it assumes family, churches, and communities are doing the work of formation. That assumption is not naive. It was inherent from centuries of civilizational experience that taught one brutal lesson over and over again. The people who cannot govern themselves will always be governed by something else. And that lesson shaped everything the founders built. The Western Christian Paideia didn't begin in Philadelphia. It did not begin in 1776. It did not begin with America at all. It began with the Greeks, who understood that education existed to shape virtue, not feelings. Plato believed a society could not Plato believed a society could not be just unless its civilians were trained to love truth and restrain desire. Aristotle taught that freedom without virtue collapses into chaos. Liberty to them was never license. It was self-mastery. Right? Like that's why I believe as a Christian, the only acceptable form of control is self-control. Rome took those ideas and gave them permanence. Rome law assumed hierarchy, duty, obligation, and accountability. Citizens were formed to understand that order preceded freedom and discipline preserved it. But the ancient world still lacked something essential, a universal moral authority that bound the rulers as tightly as they ruled. Christianity changed that forever. Christianity didn't destroy classical education. It completed it. It taught that every human being bears the image of God, that power must be submitted to truth, that authority is real but limited, that freedom is inseparable from responsibility, that the human heart is failing and must be governed, first by conscience, then by law if necessary. Right? This is the transformation that Hegseth emphasized in his book. Christianity didn't produce chaos. It produced restraint, and it didn't undermine order. It moralized it, right? Western civilization became Christian not because of force, but because Christian formation produced stable families, disciplined citizens, restrained rulers, and ordered liberty. Out of that formation came universities, common law, representative government, and eventually constitutional republicanism. America is downstream from that river. One of the most important points is also the modern. One of the most important points is also the most modern Americans was the one that most modern Americans miss entirely. The founders did not debate whether Christian morality, whether Christian moral formation was necessary. They assumed it. They assumed families would form children, right? They assumed churches would teach restraint and duty. They assumed education would shape character. They assumed citizens would govern themselves. That's why the Constitution is short. That's why it's restrained. That's why it does not attempt to manufacture virtue through law. John Adams said it outright. The Constitution was made for moral and religious people and was wholly inadequate for any other person. It was not optimism. That was a warning. George Washington called religion and morality indispensable supports of political prosperity. James Madison understood that no structure could restrain power if the people themselves lacked virtue. They didn't build a Christian nation by statute. They built a republic that required Christian formation to survive. Early American education was not neutral. It was never meant to be. Schools taught history as moral instruction. They taught literature as character formation. They used the Bible openly, not as propaganda, but as moral architecture. Do you know that when they learned the ABCs, they did it through scripture in school? They trained students to restrain appetite, honor duty, respect authority, and sacrifice for the common good. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, they weren't factories for ideology. They weren't lefty grooming campuses like they are now. They were institutions designed to produce leaders capable of ruling themselves before ruling others. Education was the engine that sustained the republic, not policy, not elections, not formation. The Western Christian Paideia did not disappear by accident. It was removed systematically through public education. For most of American history, education enforced the moral formation already happening in the home, the church, the local, the community. Schools assumed Christianity, taught virtue openly, and understood their role as shaping citizens capable of self-government. Education existed to form character, not reinvent it. That changed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As public education centralized control shifted away from parents and local communities towards bureaucrat, experts, and professional educators who no longer believed in moral formation belonged in schools at all, at least not Christian moral formation. They replaced it with a claim of neutrality. But neutrality is a freaking lie. Education is never neutral. Every system of education forms students towards something. Whether Christian formation was removed, or when Christian formation was removed, it was replaced not with nothing. It was replaced with a noted hostility towards Christian and competed moral vision rooted in secular progressivism. Biblical instruction was pushed out. Moral absolutes were declared dangerous. Virtue was recast as personal preference. Discipline was reframed as oppression. Authority became suspect. And tradition became something that dismantled rather than inherited. Public education isn't just stopping the teaching of the Western Christian Paideia and actively trained students against it. It still frickin' does. Over time, schools stopped reinforcing self-restraint and began celebrating self-expression. That's why you got schools in frickin' Oregon that let your kids act like cats and dogs pissing in frickin' litter boxes in the corner. They stopped teaching duty and began teaching grievances. They stopped forming citizens and began shaping activists. And because education is formative by nature, the results compounded across generations. By the time Americans noticed something was wrong, the formation pipeline had already been rerouted. Families were told to stand down. Churches were told to stay quiet, and they still are. I find that most churches and their leaders are cowards because they don't want you to lose their tax exemption. Parents were told their obstacles, and the state, through public education, became the primary shaper of children's moral worldview. The collapse of the Western Christian Paideia is not primarily a political failure. It is an educational one. A republic that once depended on Christian formation handed that responsibility to institutions that rejected it, and then acted surprised when the culture followed. When you remove the Western Christian Paideia, when you remove the Christian Paideia from education, you don't get freedom. You get fragmentation, you get dependency, and eventually you get people who no longer govern themselves. And this is in theory. This is played out in real time in our country at the moment. Reparations for BS that we had nothing to do with. Free handouts with EBT. I don't want to work. Just give me what I'm like. Get the hell out of here. You don't want to work? You don't want to participate in the Great Republic? Leave. We don't want you here. When the Christian Paideia is removed, something else fills the vacuum. Formation never stops, especially when it comes to our kids. We saw that over the last 4 years as they tried to groom them. It is not only transferred. When families weaken, the state expands. When churches are sidelined, ideology replaces morality. I mean, see that in a lot of these Lutheran churches accepting gay pastors. What the hell is that about? When virtue disappears, regulation multiplies. This is not coincidence. It's cause and effect. People who cannot govern themselves will always be governed by something else, by bureaucracy, by force, or by those who understand power better than they do. The modern crisis is not a political first, it's formational first. The Western Christian Paideia is not one option among many. It is the civilizational operating system that made our liberty possible. You don't get freedom without discipline. You don't get rights without responsibility. You don't get a republic without citizens capable of restraint. And you don't save America by tweaking policy. You save it by restoring formation. The American Republic does not need to be reinvented. It needs to be remembered. The Western Christian Paideia is not theory. It's the reason the American experiment worked at all, long before ballots were cast or laws were written or people were formed. They taught restraint. They were taught to restrain themselves, to honor truth, to submit to moral authority, and to govern their own conduct. The founders didn't try to invent that formation. They inherited it. They trusted it. They built a republic that depended on it. When that formation was strong, liberty flourished. When it weakened, freedom began to fracture. This isn't politics, it's history. A free society cannot survive on procedures alone. It survives when the people possess the character to sustain it. We don't have that right now. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. It's a 16-minute rant. We're going to continue within this realm of civics because I think we need it more now than we need to learn about Western expansion. Remember, history isn't boring. It's the story of a civilization that understood freedom must be taught before it can be trusted, and a republic that rose because its people were shaped by godly, biblical values and morals long before they were free. And I'll see you next time.